Steve Wehmeyer. I've been teaching in the Corps since 2008. I teach courses on Afro-Caribbean sacred arts, on aesthetic expressions, and occasionally I teach sacred and secular. And I actually want to talk a little bit about how we might approach, in Core 250, questions about myth and ritual. I think these are really important elements to the study of both religion in an historical sense and contemporary religion in everyday American life, which is really in many ways the focus of the course. I think that if we're not giving a significant amount of our attention in that class to looking at the structures of myth and ritual, we're missing something. In my sections of Core 250, I usually introduce students first and foremost to the debate that raged among early scholars of religion: which came first, myth or ritual? Do rituals proceed from myths? Are rituals enactments of sacred narratives? Or are sacred narratives dim, distant memories of archaic rituals that have been practiced over time? These were actually positions that scholars of myth and ritual advanced and argued and debated about and wondered about and worried about. And it's kind of fun to turn the students loose on that question for a couple of, a few minutes at least during one class session. One of the things I like to do is point the students toward a ritual that is familiar to them. Most of them, even the students who are not Christian, have some knowledge of the Christian Eucharist. And I ask them, sort of like, what is this ritual? And where does it come from? And why do Christians take communion? And it takes a little while, but eventually they acknowledge that it is a ritual based on a sacred narrative, that it's a reenactment of a particular Christian myth, the story of the Last Supper. Then we start talking about the Last Supper and why the Last Supper is a particularly important sacred narrative, and someone will eventually say, well, Jesus and his followers were celebrating Passover. Well, what's Passover? And then you'll get the students to talk about that. So it eventually becomes apparent that we're talking about a ritual based on a myth that is in fact a story about the reenactment of another ritual, which is based on another sacred narrative, the sacred narrative of Exodus. And by this point, the students, they enjoy the fact that it's all hopelessly confused, and we come to the conclusion, which scholars of myth and ritual have done, that it's really a chicken and egg argument, and we can't really talk about which came first. What we really can talk about is how these two forms are interconnected, which I think then takes us in some interesting directions, because getting students to think critically and structurally about the role of both sacred narrative and ritual reenactment in everyday religion it's something they can sink their teeth into, and it's also something that allows them to take the elements of religion that they often see as the strangest and come to some kind of a deeper understanding, come to really recognize that these things are actually not particularly strange at all. They're quite familiar. So I actually introduced the students kind of early on to some of the ideas that are expressed by the structuralist school of both myth and ritual, Claude Lévi-Strauss and Edmund Leach, his chief student. And we spend a lot of time talking about how the specifics of myth and ritual they're definitely important, but meaning is found in structure. And because so many of our students come from information and technology sciences backgrounds, or they're familiar with information science, one of the ideas that they really seize on, I think, is an idea put forth by Leach, that both myth and ritual exhibit the principle of redundancy. First and foremost, myth, sacred narrative, or ritual, sacred action, these are communicative systems. They're meant to communicate meaning. They're meant to say something. They're sending a message. Information science tells us that the best way to send a message is to be redundant, to send it as many times as possible and on as many different frequencies as possible. Because if something interferes with the message getting through on one frequency, if you send it on another frequency, it'll get through. So with myth and ritual, this comes down to looking at the elements that repeat. What happens over and over and over again? What gets done multiple times? What gets said multiple times? If you find the repeating elements, that's really where you find meaning in ritual. The other idea, also shamelessly stolen from Edmund Leach, that I present to the students and really try to get them to focus on, is the idea that both myth and ritual, one is narrative, one is action, they both do the same thing. They are expressions of unobservable realities in terms of observable phenomena. How do we talk about something like truth, or love, or the good, or the right? Well, ultimately, in order to talk about those things, we have to bring them down to the concrete. The symbols that are employed in myth are concrete symbols. They're things we can observe. The symbols employed in ritual are the same. They're a set of concrete physical experiences. Sense, smells, sense and smells are the same thing. Tastes, bodily movements. These are all things that, these are tangible things, but they're used to speak about intangibles. So, recognizing that really what we're looking at here are two different sorts of alphabets for talking about, or grammars and syntaxes, for talking about the unobservable with reference to the concrete, then the question follows, like, how do we decode a myth, or how do we decode a ritual? So one of the things I have my students do is an exercise that I call dividing the tribes. Okay? And it starts after we've had sort of this theoretical discussion about structure in myth and structure in ritual. I divide the students into, or rather I divide the class into two halves. And I do this with a big piece of ribbon, big red ribbon, and usually frame it as that the high god of the classroom, Wehmeyer, divided the tribes with a river of fire, and we literally stretched this ribbon down the middle of the classroom. So I got half the class on one side and half the class on the other side. Then I go among the class with a bag full of feathers. And there are an equal number of white feathers, black feathers, and red feathers in the bag. And I distribute them first on one side of the class and then on the other side of the class. So an equal number of students, or relatively equal number of students, is holding, on either side of this river of flame, is holding either a black ribbon, or a black feather, a white feather, or a red feather. And then I ask them to group themselves by feathers. So we end up with 6 groups on either side of this, divided on either side of this flaming river. Each group gets a scenario based on the color of their feathers. Now what the students don't know is that one half of the classroom, they all have the same scenarios divided by color, but one half of the classroom is focused on ritual and one half of the classroom is focused on myth. So I'll give you an example of what the scenarios go. Like, so the red feather tribe. On the left-hand side of the classroom, red feather tribe 1 gets a scenario that reads, your tribe believes that any child born to 2 full members of the tribe deserves certain unalienable rights and privileges. Outsiders are not believed to be deserving of those privileges, nor are their children. But some years ago, after a skirmish with the tribe of the white feather, your tribe took a number of white feather children captive. The captives have grown up, and as adults, they've had children with members of your tribe. So the children of these unions are of questionable tribal status. But they're loved by tribe members and are necessary for healthy growth and expansion of the society. Create a myth that supports the tribe's decision to grant these children the rights and privileges of full tribal members without overturning the red feather codes of membership. Now on the other side of the river, the red feathers have been given exactly the same scenario, but they've been told, create a ritual that makes these children full tribal members with attendant rights and privileges. The symbolic elements of this ritual should communicate these children's changed status to them and to everybody in the community. So just using those two groups, or those two halves of the same group as an example, we set them to work. And the students actually they enjoy this because it's a creative exercise. After a certain point, the river of flame is removed. And the students who have been developing a myth get to reconvene with the students who have been developing a ritual. What I've found, kind of unexpectedly, it's what I hoped would happen, but I didn't plan on it happening, but it seems to have happened anyway, is that both groups, without consulting with one another, usually end up working with the same set of symbols. Or the ritual and the myth are very like one another. Then, the various groups are given this instruction. Once they're reunited, they're told, okay, now you've got to make sense. You ritualists have to make sense out of this myth, and you mythologists have to make sense out of this ritual. And you've got to put these two things together. And sometimes that requires a little bit of negotiation, but very often the two things fit together well. And then the students, as a whole, all of the red feathers, share their myth and ritual with the other students. And the white feather tribe has kind of an interlocking myth as well. So for example, the white feather tribe is told, your tribe left its ancient ancestral homeland many ages ago and traveled far, never settling in one place for very long. 2 or 3 generations ago, the tribe reached an abundant fertile river valley with resources to meet the needs of the tribe for as long as they chose to remain there. But this valley is used by the tribe of the red feather, who hunt and fish there. They're not like you. They speak an uncouth language and have strange ways and customs. You have no wish to join them, yet you don't want to leave the valley. Create a myth that establishes your tribe's connection to the valley and your right to be there, and helps account for your relationship with the tribe of the white feather. And then the other side of the white feather have to create a ritual that does the same thing. After the students have had a chance to play around with this for a while, we speak as a class about how, what we're really talking about here are questions of membership in a community. Look at the way we in the contemporary United States handle rituals and narratives of immigration and nationalization. How do we ritualize the nationalization of those who come from somewhere else, or those who perhaps are not born here but want the status of citizens? What stories do we tell ourselves? What sacred stories as a state do we tell ourselves about the value of membership? Similarly, the white feather story is all about manifest destiny and about ownership of land. And certainly our students are familiar both on religious levels and on state levels with stories about claiming territory and with rituals that involve claiming territory. So it's a pretty short leap from the stuff that they've created to looking at real scenarios where both myths and rituals have been evolved in order to answer these important communal questions. And I think by giving students the opportunity to create these things for themselves, they gain a better understanding of the role that these both narratives and collections of ritual action play in the lives of people of faith in contemporary America.